I think that an unleashed leader is someone who isn't confined or pressured or just operating within the expectations of society or others of what a leader is supposed to be and what they are supposed to be, but is someone who is rooted in their values, is rooted in the work that they are trying to do and the impact that they are trying to have in the world, and goes about that in an authentic way that is truly about the abundance of how you can do that.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Today, we are joined by our guest, Jen Casimiro, and she is the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Profit. She's based out of the Bay Area in Northern California. And today, we're going to be hearing about different styles of leadership and how that influenced her choice and the type of leader she has evolved to become, so she can find that authentic leadership to build inclusive teams. And then we're also going to be looking at how do we then use that superpower to leverage the diverse strengths of our teams to impact the customer experience, revenue, and performance. Jen, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Lee. I'm honored to be here and to be sharing space and sharing my story with you.
It's a great story. I'm really looking forward to going deeper on it. I've only gotten a snippet so far. So why don't you start, first of all, Jen, just tell us a little bit about your current role and what you at Profit are doing for organizations, and then we'll jump into the origin story that led to you being here.
Sure. So the current capacity that I serve in is as the head of DEI, as you named. I often tell folks as a DEI practitioner that I'm a systems designer with an expertise in equity, because as a head of DEI, I'm looking at our organizational systems and our business systems and our people systems to identify opportunities for us to be more inclusive, to be more equitable. So in addition to when people hear DEI, ERG work and the programming, I'm also saying, okay, how can we look at how we promote? How can we look at how we do business? How can we look at how we grow our people and making sure that it's serving all of our people, not just a subset of a community?
That's great. I love that, expertise in equity and then a system thinking perspective, right? Because diversity has so many dimensions to it. We tend to focus on like the big three or four, but looking at it systematically and how do we better understand that so we can enhance, again, the outcomes that we're achieving, whether it's better customer experiences or community impact or, inclusion and equity internally to the organization. I love that angle. But you had some unique experiences that well qualified you to be an expert in equity. Let's talk a little bit about your origin story. Tell us a little bit about your family and what it was like growing up in a family of very strong matriarchs versus some of the stereotypes that are associated with that.
Yeah. So I am a third generation Filipino woman born and raised in San Francisco. And my family, we now have four generations here in the Bay Area. And growing up, I was, like you named, I was surrounded by really strong, vocal women, like women who knew and understood their power, not just internally in our family, but also out in the world. It's amazing, right? To see the strong woman like my mom and my grandmothers and my aunties be strong and vocal and passionate, in our family parties. But I also saw them, be like that out in the world. You know, I joke too, but it's true that like it's my family, it's through the women in my family that I learned that I could stand up for myself and that I could have a voice. And it wasn't just that I had strong women and strong matriarchs. It was that the men in my family too, who were also strong masculine men, that they were not threatened by the strength of the woman in my family. And so it created really strong examples for me of what leadership looked like, of what I could be and what I could look like. And I know that is a blessing and a privilege because that was my foundation. I was like, that's what I'm going to grow to be. That was just the standard for me in my household, at least. as you get older and you watch TV and you have different and you engage with institutions, you have different examples of that. But my foundation was strong, vocal, passionate woman.
Yeah. And I loved how you described it as it wasn't something that was taking away, from the role of the men in the relationship. It was like, when we talk about equity, it's not about replacing, right? It's about adding. And so you grew up in a household that demonstrated that the masculine energy and the feminine energy were both powerful and important and needed to have both of their opportunities to be fully expressed, not like one was, covering or replacing the other. So is there an example of you, interacting with, other siblings or cousins or family members where you saw an example of how that feminine energy and that masculine energy, blended to provide the kind of, great upbringing that you had?
When I say strong, powerful woman, I mean that in all the diversity of what that means. I think when people also say, when I say strong women, they might think in comparison, oh, they must be like strong in terms of how that looks like for a man or a masculine type of person. And what I mean is that I've had, of course, the very like strong vocal, like in your face, type of leadership women in my family, but I also had the strength and the softness women in my family who I could tell they weren't kind of the front of the room, but they were still strong and passionate in how they show up. And so I even see that your question around in my childhood and my upbringing, even between my sister and I are very, very different. I'm an extrovert. I like to be like front of the room. I like to like be around a lot of people. My sister is an introvert. She's like, I want to stay at home. I don't want to be in crowds of like folks I don't know. But we grew up in the same household where I do still feel like I see the strength in how she shows up, right? As a mother, as a working mother, it doesn't look like me, right? My leadership is very direct. It's very front of room. It's very much, I'm the person like, I'm ready to fight. I get that from my mother, fight for what's right.
For those of you who are listening on the audio, Jen has, flaming red hair. Like, I mean, she is the quintessential Wonder Woman. So,
And my sister is the opposite in that she doesn't want to be the front of the room, but she has so much power when I see her with our family. Like she's the person that everyone in the family knows and trusts and goes to. When I see her as a mom, she doesn't let anybody mess with her children. It's like that strength when it comes to our values, that we stand behind our values. And so I even see in how we engage with different contexts differently, right? Because we're so different. But I could tell that our foundation is the same, right? And having a strong mom and having, both of our grandmothers are still alive, plus higher beings that they're still alive in their 90s and they're still strong and how they tell their stories. And so I see that even across my cousins. I said we're 4 generations deep, we're all so different, but we all have never felt like we are being silenced, right, by our families.
when you talk about that strength, right, it doesn't have to be necessarily loud or quiet, but when you look at a pillar of a building, that was what the word came to my mind as you're describing like your sister and the strength that you said some of your moms and your aunts had. They were pillars, right? And a pillar is so strong, right? I mean, it displaces so much weight and it can carry it year after year after year without budging an inch. And it doesn't do it by being loud. It does it by doing just calmly supporting that. And then, that gives the building its architecture, it gives the building its beauty. It allows for these grand openings and these large foyers where communities can value. And you have this silent sentinel, right? That is just holding it up. When you said values, it's like those pillars, what makes them strong and what makes them grounded is not their volume, it's the values.
Right.
We know what we stand for, and we're going to hold the roof over this community in that standing of it in perpetuity. And we're going to pass it generation to generation so that it continues to stand. I mean, that describes, the sustainability and the strength that comes from somebody really being grounded, and yes, some people need to hear it. Some people need to see it. Some people need
Right.
to feel it. So we need all of those dimensions of leadership mixing, to make a community as vibrant, as beautiful as it is. That's what came to my mind when you were telling that story, Jen.
I love that. I mean, it's a good visualization of also the different ways that we all contribute to that, right? My sister is like strong foundation, she's calm. I can be like that, but I'm like, if something starts to shift or the foundation starts to crack or something is starting to sway, I'm the one that's like, I'm going to like put it all back together. And so we all have like different roles in that, but it's great that our foundation at home was so strong that it enabled us to also take different routes to what that looked like for us.
The biggest thing is don't cap it, right? It's like so often in, different cultures and in different parts of our society that gets capped because of your gender. And our whole thing is like, no, your gender has a way of showing it, and you can have all the flavors underneath of that gender cap, but like take that off, right? Like, you get to show up in the way that, you're supposed to be in this world. And your family modeled that was possible. And then because you saw that it was possible, you believed it was possible, and then you've been leashed, right? You haven't been capped.
Yes.
Well, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about a pivotal moment in your origin story when you were this amazing basketball player and you've got all this energy that's just being displaced constantly on the court and off the court. Tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you as an athlete and what you discovered in that moment.
So I am a 5 foot small Filipina. And so when I tell people that basketball is a huge part of my story, they are a little surprised. So speaking of other biases, right, when they see me, they're like, basketball, huh?
Uh-huh.
And I go, yeah, I played, year round since I was 10. I traveled across the country. I played in high school and I played in college. And so it was a big part of my story. And what really kind of brought through a lot of like different ways of being in leadership through the sport, both on and off, because I think I was a captain in many of the teams that I've ever been on. And it had a lot to do with because I was small. So I couldn't like push people around, right? I couldn't use my body in those types of ways. I had to use it in very strategic ways. I had to build my skill and also build my knowledge of the game because that was going to get me further because I wasn't the most athletic. I was athletic, but I wasn't like the most athletic and I wasn't the biggest and I wasn't the strongest. And so in addition to working really hard, I also needed to learn a lot about the game on and off the court. And so that really helped me also understand what type of leader that I wanted to be on these teams. I think early on I was like, oh, I'm just organically like stepping into these, like people are asking me to like be a leader. That felt nice. But I think in hindsight, as you get older, you're like, oh, it's because I put in the work around understanding and knowing so that I could be able to teach, that I could be able to like tell other folks, like, here's what's going on, here's what we need to do, and leveraging different ways to do that.
But you mentioned something I think is really important, and you have several things, but one in particular is that I think when folks talk about leveraging diversity, it's like, well, let's not acknowledge that. Let's say that we're all the same, and it's like we're not. The whole point of diversity is we're not the same. And so in your case, you're like, I didn't have the size, I didn't have the brute strength, but what you brought was the strategic and the skills.
Right.
And that was your way of adding value. No, yes, you were fast, you were skilled, you were coordinated. So you have that. That is a bit of a prerequisite for that game.
Yes.
But your point is like we're different. And so what you did is rather than whining and moaning, like, oh, I wish I was 6'10" and I wish I was, could bench press, whatever, you said, here's what I have, here's what I've been given,
Right.
and here's how I can use it and add value. And so it's almost the absence of certain strengths allowed other strengths to shine brighter.
Right.
Now, because if you had been born 7 feet tall, you would have been able to just muster your way through. The inherent skill that you had as a strategist and as a team communicator would not have probably shined out as brightly.
Right.
So I just think that's an important thing to recognize. It's like, it's okay to say, I'm not good at something. That's indeed what makes us great at other things.
I think in that too, in this opportunity and being able to have a family that invested in this passion of mine, was that in being the strategist, I also learned about the full game. I didn't just learn about what it meant to be a point guard, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I learned about what about the game, what are the different roles, what is the strategy of like an offensive like movement, what is the strategy around like defense, like how does this all come together? That enabled me to be able to say, okay, like here's what I think, and be able to talk with my coaches and things like that. So it wasn't like I'm going to just get really good at understanding my role. But because of the opportunity to think about, okay, let me take a step back and understand the full system, how it all works together, then I'm better able to say, hey, like so and so who's a center, if you like set this screen and roll this way, I could see you and I could dish it off to you, right?
Yeah.
Again, enables me to be a better communicator, enables me to be a better teammate. That then I think allowed for me to step organically into the moments where like I was able to take on these leadership roles. It sounds silly now, but like being a team captain at the age of 12, 13, 14, those are my first stages and those were my first opportunities to really understand what does that mean that I'm a team captain? What does that mean that I'm a leader? When you're young, you're like, oh, that just means I'm super cool. But it's more than that, right? And you learn that as you get older. And it's not until in hindsight you're like, wow, would I have gotten here if I didn't start there?
Well, it's one of the few competencies. I mean, so you talk about like, hey, I'm great at electrical engineering. I'm great at finance. I'm great at marketing, right? It's like, well, when did you start learning that skill? For most folks, they're going to be like, well, sometime in my 20s, right? But leadership is one of the few skills that everybody starts getting doses of, like on week 6 of your life. How your parents interact, like you talked about, like, what your sports experience are like academically, friends, peer groups, right? You're getting exposure to those models, your entire life. One last thing on this notion of leadership at at that formative age and into college, you weren't always the team captain, and just because you were the team captain didn't mean you were the only leader. So there were different flavors of leadership that showed up. How would you describe some of those different flavors of leadership in terms of how it manifested? And in particular for you, as a young woman, as a Filipino, as somebody who's 5 foot, standing on your tippy toes, how did that then inform your leadership style?
A big part of it was understanding that everyone has a role. And we're conditioned really early on that like a leader looks a certain way. It looks like this, it talks like this. And through basketball, really, and through other different opportunities, was seeing that we needed different ways of being at different moments of time. So if we take the game of basketball, there's so many ups and downs. Like you could be on the winning team and you're winning by 30, but you could be on the other side and be losing by 30. All those different moments requires a different way to show up in your leadership. Basketball is a team sport, is not an individual sport. You need everyone. And so in the moments where you're on a team and I've been in those situations where you're losing by 30, to have someone be like, we still got to do this. We're still going to play hard. We're still going to show up. To have someone be inspirational like that. So there have been moments where like I'm the captain and I feel defeated. And I'm like, this sucks. Like this doesn't feel good. I'm over it. Is the game over? And I've had teammates being like, get it together, y'all. We're still who we are. We're still a great team. We still love each other. Like we still have to put our all out on there, even if we are losing. And that takes leadership. And so that person may not have been a captain or seen as like the go to person, but that person stood in their leadership and made a choice and said, we need to do this right now. And I think that's what's important about leadership is a choice, it's a moment by moment doing. And so everybody has the opportunity to be a leader. And I think that's what I learned in those early days was that it looks different for different moments because yeah, sometimes when it's toe to toe and it's a tie game and there's like 30 seconds left, you're going to have the person you go to, right? But it's just as important in the low moments and the hard moments how everyone else is showing up, and those are the opportunities where you see, damn, that person that like in my head was like, oh, that person's not a leader, they showed up and made a choice and said, I'm going to be a leader in that moment.
That was such a brilliant quotable quote there, right? Leadership's not about the position, it's about the choices. And how you behave and how you contribute is a demonstration of those choices. Let's transition from these great insights that you got cultivated with lots of repetitions before you even had a business card. How does that now translate into what you're seeing in terms of your authentic leadership and how you build your team and how you help other teams at Profit build their teams?
So entering into the workforce, it's interesting, right? Because when I was playing basketball, even in college when I was playing, or as a leader in different capacities in college, when you enter into the workforce, there's kind of this feeling of like, oh, I'm starting from ground zero. I'm less than everyone else. going into that, again, a blessing and very intentional for me. I started my career in leadership development. And so what that meant was that I was from the get entering into the workforce, learning about myself, who I was, what was my style, what did leadership mean, and also having my own internalizations of biases and how the world works. There was a lot of internal conversations early on my career around like, oh, well, like, that this is your leadership style, Jen, but like you need to tone yourself down, or you need to quiet yourself. You can't be as loud, or you said that one thing and they didn't like how you said it there. And so early on in my career, I had a lot of kind of cognitive dissonance around like, I know my leadership style and I know who I am, but I'm getting into these places where we know that workforces have different biases and a lot of stuff happening. And I was getting signals that was like, wait, that's not how people wanted me to be. That's not how they wanted me to show up. And so that was a lot for me to navigate.
And that's interesting because on the one hand, you're like, okay, well, is that because, they have a problem with receiving what I'm doing? But on the flip side, you're like, well, these are your customers. So if your customers aren't receiving you the way you want to be received, so how do you be authentic and at the same time being empathetic, right? Like both of those, and it's like, no, here, this is who I am. Hear me roar. You're like, okay, we're going to alienate everybody. On the same time, if you're just like, well, I just respond to what everybody wants, well, then now who are you? And so I think authentic and empathetic, like the in between there is that real nexus of power. So tell us a little bit more about that.
I often tell folks now that like it's important to know who you are and understand and know yourself, because that's where your authenticity comes from. Because then if you don't know that, you are performing or trying on someone else's leadership.
And you're just shifting in the wind. There's no, you can't be a pillar if the bottom's not attached to anything, right? Like you're just hanging
Exactly.
from the ceiling.
My career is in DEI. And so it was like, this isn't working, dismantle it all, burn it all down. And, early on in my career, I was like, that's not working. That's who I am. But something's not working, right? And so I think it was through a lot of failures for me personally, because I had that strong foundation at home, because I had different opportunities to step into my leadership. I wasn't easily swayed by other people around like, don't be like that. And so for me, it was always a question around like, is that my stuff or is that your stuff?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right? Is what's going on here? Because I truly believe all feedback is helpful feedback, because it always tells you how you're landing, is your message coming across, what's working, what's not working, so that you can adjust, not for you to just internalize automatically whatever anyone is saying is true. I do believe understanding, analyzing feedback is a skill. And so, luckily for me, I started my career in leadership development. So I was building out that skill early on, like starting my career. The thing about me is that, like, authentically inside of work or outside of work, I was like, I will always stand in the voice of my power. I will always stand in that, because I do believe, because of my foundation, it's rooted in my values of what I believe and what I want the world to be. And I was constantly getting information, what was working and what wasn't, and who the identities of who I was getting that feedback from was really important too, right? Because it was different. I was getting feedback from folks who are coming from similar identities, folks who are coming from marginalized identities, saying like, thank you, we need you to fight, no one else is fighting for us. I was getting different feedback from other folks who were like, that's too much, like tone down, like a lot of tone policing. And it's all still helpful, because I was like, okay,
It allows you to calibrate, right? You said, like I said,
exactly.
all feedback is a gift. It doesn't mean you take it and just react at face value. You're like, okay, what does that mean? How do I use that? And then I calibrate, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so when I transitioned into kind of directorship and supervision and all of those things, I had to really rethink, what are my values? What am I trying to do around what it means to be center the most marginalized, around doing equity work? And also, what does it mean that I'm here now? Because I think early in my career is about fighting to get there. I deserve a seat at the table. You're not hearing these voices. And then when I got to leadership, I totally fell on my face multiple times. People were like, Jen, why are you fighting? You're here. Like, we're listening to you. And I was like, oh, I don't have to fight anymore. That's different for me. That was a very pivotal moment in my leadership where I'm like, what is my leadership if it's not, if I don't have to fight? And so I think that's important about leadership too, is that it's not stagnant. It's always changing because we're human, we're complex, and we are changing. And so I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, I have agency in shifting and being adaptable in my leadership. And authentic leadership doesn't have to be stagnant. It doesn't have to be like, oh, this is who I am. I think there's some things around like, what's my identity and what do I want to be known for? And how do I make sure that my leadership is rooted in my values, but that it's adaptable, that it's flexible? Because now I'm working with not just our most marginalized folks, our individual contributors. I'm working with leaders and executive leadership, and how I land and how I communicate has to shift in order in service of the work that I'm doing.
So now, not only are you modeling this and you're doing it now you're there. You're like, okay, I can chill a little bit. I don't have to be breaking through. I've broken through. Tell us about how that passion is showing up today and how you're trying to elevate the ability to harness these diverse skills, for impact.
Yeah. So I think today, you know, I have the privilege both in like my position and in the identities that I hold, that like I have more access to the business, the understandings of like how people are working, to different systems. And so I think early on in my career, impact was a lot, and still is, was a lot through like influence. And so now I have access to different people, to different leaders, to different parts of the business. And so what impact looks like now is through scale. It's, it's still in deep in relationship, but a lot now through designing systems that are equitable, but also bringing other people along is such an important part of my work.
Is there a specific example? Maybe it's a composite of a couple of experiences you had, right? Of where you were able to exercise that influence in the relationship to bring somebody along.
Let's take inclusive leadership. I was designing kind of a leadership session, and one of the parts of this leadership session was around inclusive leadership. And the thing about inclusive leadership, I think everyone theoretically understands it. It's through the action that people start to like, okay. And I had a leader who was like, well, why are we doing this? Like, we're good here. And so for me, one, in my leadership, I need to be able to see, okay, I don't want to shoot this person down, say, well, you're wrong. That's wrong. Right. So that's the first moment to bring them along in this. I say that my work sometimes is about translation. It's about taking something and saying, you're seeing it this way. Let's maybe see it this way. Let me help you understand and look at it a different way. And so with this particular leader, one, validating, yes, you're a great leader. Where we can be great, if we can be better, should we not be better? Let's be better. So I think when I say bringing people along, and specifically in DEI, or what, it's like you find yourself trying to convince a manager or someone, say like, we need to do something around DEI. One is like being able to articulate and communicate the why. What's going on here? What's the delta? Where do we want to be? We're here. We could be here. This is why we need to do that. And being able to communicate that. I think sometimes in DEI, people get frustrated and they're like, it's just the right thing to do. That's not helpful for the folks who are trying to understand why we need to do something. And very early Jen would have been like, we just need to do it. Jen now, in her leadership learnings and journeys, is like, here's what's going on. Here's the journey that we're trying to make. And here's how we can be better. Not for us just as individuals, which is great. We should be better as human beings. But here's how it will also help our teams, our business, and what we're trying to do in the world. And I think that's the biggest translation. And what I mean by bringing people along in this is that why it makes us better human beings. It should be what we want. I think in getting to know myself, I learned and I have the muscles now to navigate. Okay, I didn't like how they said that, but like, let me put that here. Let me proceed with how I'm going to work with this individual, tell them why, and to also tell them how they can act on it. I think sometimes people say, oh, well, I told them about it. That's not bringing people along. Bringing people along is in the opportunities where you can share kind of the arc of what you're trying to do, the journey of what you're trying to do, and then help them practice what you're asking them to do. That's what it means to bring people along.
That's really amazing, Jen. I think that's going to be incredibly helpful in so many different dimensions, and there's lots to go there. Well, I know we're bumping up against the end of our time together. Is there anything else, that you think would be really helpful for, listeners who are on this leadership journey together with all of us that you'd like to share?
Leadership is not a destination. It's a process, it's messy, but it's also beautiful. So I think just one thing for folks who are starting to think about that wherever you're at in your career is just asking yourself, what does authentic feel like to me? If you have moments where you feel tension with someone in your leadership or your leadership in itself, asking, why do I feel that tension? Is that about me? A lot of folks in my experience haven't asked themselves those questions. So then kind of going back to the analogy that they're just kind of going with the wind. But when you can root yourself and understand and even answer those questions just with yourself, that will start to set that foundation so that you can be grounded in any of those kind of leadership moments and opportunities that you have.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.